As an introduction to the theory of evolution, I thought it would be really good for you to be able to answer these questions. What is evolution? What's the evidence for evolution? And then why does evolution matter? Now this can be a really controversial topic, so we will just stick to the very, very basics, things that we definitely know and that we can definitely see. The definition that we'll use for evolution is the progressive change in organisms over time. Now this has to be a genetic thing. It has to be something that can be passed down to future generations. Otherwise, it's just something that's been acquired, kind of like a scar or pierced ears. You're not going to see any babies of tattooed fathers born with giant mermaid tattoos on their arm. You don't inherit acquired traits. So when we talk about evolution and we talk about changes over time, these are DNA changes that can be passed on to offspring. Now there are just two core principles, or just two basics to understand, and then you've nailed evolution. The first one is called natural selection. Some people call this survival of the fittest. This just means that the environment will favor a certain trait over other traits, and that will allow an organism to survive and reproduce. So here you have a picture of some pests, and as planes fly over, crop planes, and they dust the fields with pesticide, there always seems to be one little survivor that has just the right DNA. So now all of a sudden the environment is going to favor that little bug, which can go on and reproduce and cause even more problems for the farmer down the road. That's natural selection. The second core principle for evolution that you need to understand is the idea that there's such a thing as common descent with modification. So this just means that as generations pass, as you move through time, there are slight changes made to the DNA of organisms, and that modifies them. This picture is a perfect example of this. So there at the bottom, at the beginning of this time scale, whatever it is, you've got an orange bird. And as generations pass, the color of the bird changes and changes a little more and a little more, and eventually you end up with two different species, but they came from a common ancestor. Now Charles Darwin is credited with this theory of evolution and natural selection, and he noticed this idea of common descent with modification, but you need to kind of understand where he was coming from before you give him too hard of a time. He learned about some other scientists as he was growing up. One of them was Charles Lyell, who said that there was such thing as uniformitarianism, meaning that the earth changes slowly over time, and that the changes that happened 100 years ago are probably the same as the ones happening today. Another person he grew up learning about was Cuvier, and he said that species could go extinct if the right factors come into play. Charles Darwin also learned about Malthus. He was a man who actually studied people, and he started noticing that in London, where he lived, there were more people being born than were dying each year. So what that meant is that there would eventually come to a point, the people would come to a point where there'd be a struggle for existence, meaning that there'd be not enough resources to sustain that big of a population. Now Darwin thought that applied a lot more to organisms like insects and plants than it did for humans. And the last scientist who contributed to Darwin's knowledge was Lamarck. Now Lamarck had some great ideas that had to do with evolution, but he was really, really wrong on a lot of them. He believed that evolution happened through acquiring traits. And again, you're not going to have a tattoo and then pass that on to your baby when the baby is born. So that idea was wrong, but it started Darwin thinking about other things. Some of the evidence we have for evolution, the first big one is the fossil record. The nice thing about the fossil record is that we've had these organisms that lived a long time ago, and they've been very well preserved a lot of times. And you can look at them and you can see that there's nothing like them here on the earth today. That idea leads to another idea that, hey, maybe things can live here, but if the environment doesn't favor them, they can go extinct. When you start comparing the limbs of different animals, you start to notice some similarities. We call this comparative morphology. We also call it homologous structures, and that's something you'll learn about a little later in the unit. But here you have some organisms that have different limbs, but if you look, the bones are colored in a way so you can see that each of these limbs start with a big, strong bone. Next come two smaller bones, then a set of green bones, and then groups of red bones. We just think that this is an interesting idea, and it leads to the idea that, hey, maybe we all had a common ancestor. And relating to the comparative morphology, there's also something called comparative embryology. This is when you start studying the embryos of different organisms at certain stages of development. This is a great picture that shows you that a sea lamprey, a pond turtle, a chicken, a domestic cat, and a human being all look really similar. In fact, we all have these gill slits as we're developing. And over time, we've just kind of changed. And some of us don't need the gill slits anymore, and some of us do. You can even start comparing DNA sequences between organisms and notice small changes over time. For example, there is a cytochrome C oxidase gene that most mammals and even animals and unicellular organisms have. And if you look here on this picture, it shows you that the difference between a human and a pig with this gene is only 13 amino acids. There's only 13 differences between the two. There are 66 differences between human and yeast. What that tells us is that we're much more closely related to a pig than to yeast. Lastly, you can actually observe evolution happen. You can watch it happen in one generation. I explained the idea of the survivor pest or the survivor bug in a farmer's field. This happens regularly and all the time. In fact, it even happens with bacteria. When you get sick, the doctor tells you to take your antibiotic for the whole 7 to 10 days. And the reason why is because if you don't, the bacteria can grow a resistance. They can morph and they can change over time so that they no longer respond to things like amoxicillin and Omnicef and other antibiotics. Now the goal is that you can explain what evolution is, some of the evidence for it, and why it matters. And the reason that it matters, and we haven't really talked about that much, but the reason that it matters is because it's the biggest theory and it's the most supported theory that tells us how life on Earth became so diverse